Okay. Thanks for your time, everybody. This is going to be a slightly unusual talk, I suppose, for this event. But I want to start out with some level set. Because when I hear folks from the L1 community talk about sequencing, I kind of don't recognize what they call sequencing as the sequencing in a system like Arbitrum. So let me talk first about the design of L2s. It's important to start by recognizing that the design of L2s differs from L1s, and for a very important reason, that unlike an L1, an L2 has underneath it a very successful and robust L1 consensus. And so L2s don't need to build large-scale crypto-economically secured consensus. They can rely on it. And that means that the problem of L2 design is very different from the problem of L1 design. And simply importing the design of an L1 into an L2, I think, doesn't lead you in the direction that you'd like to go. So L2 design, and I'll use Arbitrum as an example here, basically involves 4 separate components which operate together asynchronously even within the L2 design. So first you have sequencing. The job of sequencing is to receive transactions and put them into some kind of canonical order. And to do only that. The result of sequencing is a sequence of transactions. That then gets fed into 2 separate components. There's the execution component, which allows anyone to separately and independently, asynchronously execute those transactions in order to know what the result is. But also then to data management, which I'll note is a separate function from sequencing and operates asynchronously from it. That's really important for efficiency so that you can batch and compress the data. So data management takes that sequence of transactions, packages it, and posts it onto the L1 in the most efficient way. And then finally, you have proving, which again is a separate function from sequencing, execution, and data management, which proves, with respect to the data sequence as posted onto L1, what the correct outcome of execution is. Now, all honest parties already know the outcome of execution. The purpose of proving is only to tell the L1. Other parties don't need to wait for proving. Okay, so this is L2 design as it executes these days. Let me talk specifically then about sequencing, which is this process of putting transactions into order. And I'm going to start by talking about what are the goals of sequencing. And I'll build this piece by piece. But the first piece here is you want fast response time for user transactions, as fast as possible. So you'd like that to be a fraction of a second in practice. That is from the time a user submits a transaction until they get back a result or pre-confirmation from the sequencer. Second, and not the same thing, you want fast arbitrage time. What that means is that when a party sees an arbitrage opportunity, when a searcher sees an arbitrage opportunity, they have to submit their arbitrage transaction really quickly. Let me take a minute and talk about what that is and why. So arbitrage, right, means people taking advantage of stale on-chain prices for assets. Let's say the price of ETH versus USDC has gone up on Binance, but it hasn't yet gone up on the on-chain markets. Binance is a larger market, and the on-chain markets will typically follow it. So an arbitrager can then profit by buying that asset on-chain by taking advantage of the fact that the on-chain price is a little bit stale. And these arbitrage trades have several effects. First, the arbitrager makes some profit. Second, that profit is extracted from the liquidity providers in the on-chain network, causing a loss for them, which will need to be overcome by the fees in the on-chain market. And then third, the price moves to match the broader market. Right, so that's arbitrage. You'd like the arbitrage to have to go very quickly. Arbitrage has a bunch of effects. The prices stay in sync with the broader market, the arbitrager gets profit, and importantly, the fastest arbitrager gets the profit. As soon as someone does that arbitrage trade, it moves the price to match the outside market, and now the arbitrage opportunity is gone. So how much they extract depends on how long they have to wait. There's good modeling of this in the high-frequency trading or finance literature that says basically that the extraction by arbitrageurs scales as the square root of delta t, where delta t is how quickly the arbitrager has to submit once they see the arbitrage opportunity available. This delta t is sometimes called the block time, although with pipelined L2 sequencing, it's not quite exactly the block time. So it's an important goal to minimize that delta t so that arbitrageurs extract less, leaving more value in the market for liquidity providers and traders, therefore lower trading fees, and also that the prices on the on-chain markets are more up to date. That's why that second goal of fast arbitrage time. Third goal, we want our chain to almost never reorg. Why? Because, well, we want fast response time for user transactions, and we don't want that response time to have to come with the caveat, here's the result of your transaction if the sequencer is honest, unless there's a reorg. We want to get rid of that unless there's a reorg. So, and you can make reorgs happen almost never if you design the sequencer to make that happen. For example, on Arbitrum 1 and Arbitrum Nova, there have been over 1 billion transactions processed and only one reorg. So you can make reorgs happen almost never so that most users, unless they have very high value at stake, can take the pre-confirmation as good as done. Next, you want to protect users from front-running and sandwiching attacks, so there's no party who sees the user's transaction and can then insert another transaction that will run in front of it. And the way you do that is by having a hidden mempool. That means that the mempool, the set of transactions that have been submitted but not yet put into the sequence, is not known to anyone, except potentially in the case of a centralized sequencer, to the sequencer who's trusted not to exploit the information. You want the mechanism to be simple, fair, and easy to understand. You want to be able to internalize MEV value for the chain instead of having it captured by arbitrageurs or by infrastructure providers. And then you'd like it to be decentralized. Now, there are two main approaches to sequencing, and this is one big difference between Arbitrum sequencing and other forms of sequencing. The difference between the one block at a time approach versus the fast or pipelined approach. So the one block at a time approach, this is what happens if you're talking about slots, for example, and you're talking about publishing the result of a slot before the next slot, this is the model you're in. This is the model where you build a block, you publish the block, searchers analyze that block and decide what to do next, and then they submit for the next block. In the fast blocks model, the idea is we're not trying to build blocks, we're sequencing individual transactions as quickly as we can. We're trying to absolutely minimize the latency of sequencing, and that means that the process of taking in transactions and building blocks is pipelined. That is, there is no moment in time at which a party sees the latest state of the chain and can then have a guarantee of submitting the next transaction, because there are always transactions in the pipeline being processed. And blocks then are not fundamental to the sequencing model. They're just how you package the transactions after you sequence them. And indeed, you think about the sequencing, that is creating a continuous sequence or feed of transactions as the fundamental action, and blocks being just how you package those because you want to be compatible with a blockchain. All right, so Arbitrum today uses first come, first serve sequencing, and here's basically an evaluation of this. Fast response time for user transactions, that is usually 250 milliseconds or less. Fast arbitrage time, very close to 0. Faster than the block time because of the sequence, because of first come, first serve pipeline sequencing. Almost never reorg, I talked about that before, one reorg in history. Protect users from front-running and sandwiching attacks. That, with a centralized sequencer, depends on the sequencer not exploiting users. The sequencer is chosen by governance and can be fired if it misbehaves. Simple, fair, and easy to understand, first come, first serve satisfies that. What you don't have yet is internalizing MEV value for the chain and decentralization. So let me talk about how you get those two. Can we internalize MEV value? Obviously, it's possible to internalize MEV. The question is, can you do it without undermining the advantages that we already have? And so let's go back and talk about what it is that, that the arbitrageurs do. There's a really important phenomenon that you see in with first come, first serve sequencing, and that's latency racing. MEV capture in a chain like this, in a model like this, is basically a race to get your transaction in first. If there's an arbitrage opportunity, if there's a liquidation, if there's some NFT that can be claimed, whoever gets their transaction in first will get it. And so you see this phenomenon of parties racing to try to minimize their latency to get transactions in quickly. So when a price moves on an outside market, who can deliver a transaction to the sequencer fastest? So the idea in order to be able to monetize MEV value is simply to sell a head start in the latency races, to create a sort of express lane that is a little bit faster than the normal way of submitting a transaction, and then sell access to that as a way of monetizing value. The idea is that a party who has a head start in these races will win the race always or almost always. And so parties will pay to be able to get that head start. And that leads to the Timeboost design, which is, the idea is, which is basically first come, first serve, but with an express lane that's a little bit faster. So the idea is each minute will auction off to the high bidder control over the express lane for the next 1 minute period. The winner gets exclusive access to the express lane for that minute. They can put their own transactions in there, or they can set up a toll booth and control other people's transactions getting into that express lane. And then we're going to use first come, first serve sequencing, except that transactions that are not in the express lane are going to be artificially delayed by a little bit, say 200 milliseconds. That is short enough that the express lane controller knows that they'll be able to win any latency race. That's what they're paying for in the auction. But they still need to act relatively quickly. They still need to act within that 200 milliseconds, or they'll lose the race. And so you give them that advantage, which gets you the monetization, but you still require them to move fairly quickly in order to keep that arbitrage time, that delta T, low. This has been proposed before for the Arbitrum DAO. It's currently in the process of being discussed and debated by the DAO, but it's expected to move to a DAO vote before long. Okay, so where does that get us? This gives us still fast response for user transactions. Normal user transactions are 200 milliseconds slower. That is slower than it was, but still much faster than any other solution. The arbitrage time is still quite fast. Again, it's about 200 milliseconds, which is a little bit longer than before, but again, much faster than any other solution. We don't know of any other sequencer for an L2 that's faster than 2 seconds for either of these measures. You still protect users from front-running and sandwiching attacks. Because the express lane controller does not get to see other transactions, they don't get to see or filter the transactions sent in by other parties. They just get to submit like anyone else into the hidden mempool, but with a head start. It's still relatively simple, fair, and easy to understand, and it internalizes MEV value for the chain because the chain gets the revenue from these from the auction. That is chain governance, or in the case of a privately owned or operated chain, say an app chain, whoever it is that controls the chain gets to receive that revenue or decide where it goes. Now, this is still in a centralized sequencer model. So next question is, can we decentralize this? And as always in a talk, if the speaker asks a question like that, the answer will be yes. Okay, what is the key challenge here? The key challenge here, again, is not just to achieve decentralization, which would be easily done by just copying, say, how L1 does it. The key challenge is, how do we do this while maintaining the advantages of the current sequencer and maintaining the viability of this time boost approach? So that is, we want to maintain having a fast arbitrage time. And by the way, the arbitrage time can be faster than the block time. It can be faster than the user latency. We want to maintain the property that the chain almost never reorgs. And the key to that is making sure that when the sequencer gives you a pre-confirmation and tells you that your transaction will be at a certain point in the sequence, that the sequencer has the power to keep that promise. And so if that promise is violated, it can only be because the sequencer was either dishonest or faulty. We also want to still protect against front running and sandwiching. So that is, if you go to a situation that's decentralized where there are multiple sequencers operating, we don't want it to be the case that if one of those sequencers is malicious, it can see your transaction and then put other transactions in front of it. We want to maintain that protection while decentralizing. All right, so how can we do that? Here's a couple things that don't satisfy those, that don't preserve those properties. The first thing that doesn't preserve a property is a sort of proposer-builder separation, a sort of one dictator at a time model, where you have a period of time or a slot where some party has unilateral control over what the next block will be while seeing the mempool. That fails to prevent front running. And by the way, it also doesn't do well from the standpoint of resisting censorship. Another thing that doesn't work is bundling sequencing with L1 block building. Even if that not only has this one dictator at a time problem, but it also runs into the almost never reorg property, because the L1 does reorg relatively frequently. And so if you were to have L1 block builders or L1 proposers be doing the sequencing for your L2, the result would be more frequent reorgs, and you would again have the pre-confirmation coming with this big asterisk unless there's a reorg. And that we don't want to do. Okay, here's what we think does work, is to have the sequencing be done by a committee of nodes, and that committee is chosen by chain governance based on trust. Fundamentally, if you want to have a guarantee that across some committee, that at least some fraction of parties will be honest and will be non-extractive in a collective sense, then you are not going to get there by auctioning or using some mechanism by which people buy in to control, to be playing that role. Fundamentally, you need to be in a situation where the parties are in this committee are somehow threshold trusted, they're K of N trusted. And in order to do that, I think you have to be in a situation where they're chosen by chain governance and based on trust. They're known parties who have reputations, and who know that they can be fired, they can lose their job as a sequencer if they are dishonest or unreliable. And then you assume this sort of standard distributed consensus assumption that more than 2/3 of them will be honest. And the idea is we want to guarantee that all of the good properties hold under that assumption, but if that assumption is violated, that the system at least maintains progress. And because sequencers are not involved in adjudicating what is correct execution, this, even an entirely malicious sequencing committee, the worst thing they could do is censor or front run until governance steps in and changes the committee membership. So, recalling that the purpose of sequencing is only to specify which transactions have arrived and to put them in some order, we need this committee to agree on which transactions have arrived. We need them to we'll then use threshold encryption to prevent front running. And in order to apply Timeboost, it turns out, if the protocol is designed properly, to be sufficient for each committee member to apply that express lane property locally as part of the execution. I'll show in a minute in a diagram sort of how this protocol, the pieces of this protocol fit together. And I'll note, importantly, that this is a joint project between Offchain Labs and Espresso Systems to design and now to be building this protocol. All right, so let's sort of walk through how this works. We have a set of nodes who are on this committee. You can imagine there are, say, 20 committee members, and we trust that at least 14 of them are honest. And we start in each committee member separately. Here in this diagram, each sort of vertical column represents a committee member, and I'm showing 4 of them for diagram sanity, but you can imagine there are, say, 20 of them altogether. So each one starts with an intake function, where users will send transactions. So a user submitting a transaction will multicast the transaction across this committee in order to get a strong guarantee of fast inclusion. So you have the intake phase where the members receive the transactions and apply the 200 millisecond delay to non-express lane transactions. Next, you have a consensus step where the parties reach consensus on inclusion. That is, they reach consensus on a set of transactions that have arrived, and that the rules of that consensus are structured in a way that prevents front running. In other words, an ordinary transaction, in order to get included, needs to be mentioned by at least an anti-quorum of the committee. At least, that is, if you imagine it's a 14 of 20 trust assumption, you need at least 7 members to mention that they've seen a transaction in order to include it. That way you know that that transaction was not crammed in late by some single party or set of malicious parties. So assuming that a sufficient number of members say they've seen a transaction, it will be on this inclusion list for the round. So this round of the protocol produces an inclusion list. That's a set of transactions. Now, users are free to submit their transactions either in plain text or in encrypted form. By submitting in encrypted form, they make sure that there's no committee member that can see the transactions yet, because at this point, the transactions that have been put on the inclusion list will include some that are encrypted. By the way, if you're building this, you need to also accept non-encrypted transactions, because some users will submit directly to these sequencer nodes from legacy wallets. And legacy wallets will submit plain text transactions. But nonetheless, we expect that over time, more and more of them will be encrypted, and the ones that come from sophisticated parties will be encrypted. Other parties can use trusted intermediaries who do the encryption for them. All right, so after reaching a consensus inclusion list, that is a set of transactions, some of them encrypted, which all honest parties agree on, you then have a threshold decryption phase. The parties broadcast their shares of decryption. Again, this threshold encryption is set up so that it requires at least one honest party to participate in the decryption. In the 14 of 20 trust assumption, that means you need 7 decryption shares. Enough so that at least one, there must be at least one honest one. And so the parties broadcast now among the committee their decryption shares for these encrypted transactions. Once each party has received enough decryption shares for each of the encrypted transactions, they can decrypt everything and move on to the next phase. Now, after this phase, all honest parties have the same list of transactions, and those are all and they're all in plain text. Next, there's an ordering phase, which applies a deterministic ordering rule within the round. That, again, because it's deterministic and all honest parties start with the same list, all honest parties produce the same ordering. The results of this then gets pushed down a queue to a block building phase. Remember, in this style of sequencing, the pipeline style of sequencing, block building is just kind of packaging that happens after the production of a sequence. And so this, again, is a deterministic step. All honest parties do it in the same way and get the same result. Now you have a situation where in the 14 of 20 scheme, at least 14 members of the committee have produced the same block. They sign that block, and you aggregate those signatures to get a sequencer signature on that block. Now, this is basically the whole protocol. This operates in a pipelined way, meaning that you don't run it end to end and then start the next round. You start each round, you start one round about every 250 milliseconds. And of course, state-of-the-art consensus protocols are designed to operate in a pipelined way. And so this whole process can be pipelined, producing blocks at 250 millisecond intervals. And this allows you to, again, I've left out some details, and there is a detailed specification that describes the rules of all of these phases and what properties are provided. But by doing this, you can get decentralization and maintain the good properties. So let's go back to that. Let's go back to that report card. I've now added the decentralized checkmark. I have made the checkmark for fast response time for user transactions a little bit smaller. And the reason for that is there are 2 prices that you need to pay two downsides to doing decentralization in this way. One downside is that because you're reaching a consensus, as part of this process, it's going to take longer end to end. So the response time for user transactions now needs to include a little bit of extra time for the BFT consensus among the committee. Again, it's not a massive scale consensus. Think of it as a 20-party consensus among parties who are chosen in part because they are responsive and well-resourced. But nonetheless, it's a little bit slower. The arbitrage time is still the same as it was with centralized sequencing, because even though it's a longer end-to-end processing time for a transaction, if you're an arbitrager, your advantage is that 200 milliseconds of Timeboost advantage that you bought and no more. And so your deadline for when you have to submit an arbitrage is the same as it was in the centralized case, and so you don't give that up. And that's really unique, I think, among decentralized sequencing protocols here. The rest of the properties still exist, provided that the committee is threshold honest, and now you get to a very nice outcome. Okay, so that's it. I'm happy to talk more about this. I'm especially happy to talk to people who are thinking about new sequencing paradigms. We have a lot of experience in designing and operating a sequencer and seeing what it is that users and developers really want from a sequencer. And we're happy to share that, that knowledge with the community. Thanks. Do you have time for questions?
Why don't you take questions as the next speaker is setting up? So, Demers. So if there are any questions for Ed, I'll...
Tons of questions.
Yeah. Great. Do we have a mic to go around?
Hey, thank you for this interesting presentation. I have a question on how much revenue you get from the auction on the Timeboost.
How much revenue do you get? Well, so this is still a proposal, and so you can only estimate. What I think is true is that the party who buys the advantage will be able to capture the vast majority of the MEV that's available on the chain. And so we expect that you're likely to recover a significant fraction of the MEV that's available on the chain. How much there is exactly is a bit of an open question. There are some studies on this. You know, if you look at published studies of MEV on Arbitrum, there's one study that looks at only one type of arbitrage and finds an estimate of a little over $50 million a year of MEV value captured by searchers. But we don't have an estimate of how much MEV value there is overall across the Arbitrum chain. That's really only an estimate. Let me see. Okay, great. If I could go to the next question. Let me know when you're ready.
Hello, thanks for the talk. This is Matej from Matter Labs. I have more of a curiosity question about the decentralized Timeboost.
Sure.
How do you agree on the timestamp of the incoming transactions? You like take the median, or how does it work?
No, there's not. So there's not a consensus on the timestamp of individual transactions. There is only consensus on which transactions are deemed to have arrived within a time slot. So if you imagine time that each round of this protocol starts at a particular time, and the parties are agreeing on which transactions have arrived before that time.
Which is basically equivalent. You need to agree on whether it arrived or not, and different participants in the protocol might see this differently, right?
Oh, yes, absolutely, right.
And you just need to pick one.
So I'm happy to...
Well, we can take it offline. I find it's interesting. Yeah.
I'll give you a more detailed answer offline, but briefly, the answer is approximately that any transaction which, if F members can be, of the committee can be malicious, basically any transaction that F+1, where you know that F+1 members say they have seen it before the beginning of, before the round deadline, that will be included.
All right, thank you.
That's the rough answer. And I think he's still trying, so maybe one more.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. You clearly laid out the objectives that you have for sequencing for Arbitrum. Justin recently talked about shared sequencing quite a lot. Do you anticipate a future where the solution designed by Offchain Labs and Arbitrum is also onboards other rollups in the ecosystem to provide shared sequencing to them as well? And how would you decide on who can leverage this shared sequencing solution?
Yes, I think two things. First of all, from the beginning, this will be available to all Arbitrum technology chains. And they can use separate sequencers to do that. There's nothing difficult you need to do to extend this to shared sequencing, where you have multiple parties who use the same sequencer committee and a single consensus on which transactions are deemed to have arrived across different chains. As far as which chains can use it, we always take the approach that each party can make their own decisions. That is, any set of chains who are willing to use the same shared sequencer are welcome to do that. Adding shared sequencing to this in the sense of having a single sequencer that serves multiple chains and that accepts bundles of transactions that are included atomically, it's not difficult to extend this. It's not difficult at all to extend this to do that. And I expect that to happen. But it's really a voluntary arrangement, because if you move into a shared sequencing space, the chains are agreeing to trust each other to a certain extent, and they're agreeing to share infrastructure. Situations like problems with gas pricing on one chain affect the throughput of the other chains. It's not so simple as just putting chains together, I think, but which is why I think it's important that they associate themselves in a voluntary way. That's really the answer. Anyone who wants to do this in a shared way will be able to do it. Right. Let me pass the baton. If people have further questions, I'll be around, and immediately now I'll be outside in the hall.